Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good wherever you are, and welcome to another SNIA presentation. The Cloud Storage Technologies Initiative is pleased to present you with a presentation on data privacy and data protection in the COVID era. Before we go any further, I'd just like to congratulate my American cousins on managing a smooth transition from one president to another. Congratulations on a demonstration of how democracy can really work. Thank you. So, without further ado, let me introduce myself and my co-speakers here. My name is Alex McDonald. I'm the moderator for the session today, and I'm an independent consultant and chair of the SNIA CSTI, the Cloud Storage Technologies Initiative. Today, we're joined by Mounir Elmously, who is a senior manager, consulting services with EY. Good morning, Mounir. It's good morning for you, isn't it?
It is good morning, yes.
Yes, good morning. And also by Eric Hibbard, with lots of letters after his name, who is the chair of the SNIA Security Technical Working Group. If you want to know something about security, Eric's your man. Good morning, Eric.
Good morning, Alex. And it's more about insecurity, I think.
Yes, Eric specializes in insecurity. We're not joined today, unfortunately, by Glyn Bowden from HPE, who has unfortunately been taken sick. I think he's suffering from the effects of having had COVID. So we all wish him well and hope that he makes a speedy recovery. So just a very quick legal notice. The material presented here is copyrighted by us. There aren't any warranties. Anything we say here, if you even think that it's passing for legal opinion or any technology advice, please, there are no warranties expressed or implied, and use it at your own risk. The information presented here is our personal opinions. These are our best opinions. This is good quality stuff, but we're not lawyers, and we are certainly not going to warrant anything that we say today. Also, could you please note the copyright? This project is this presentation is a project of SNIA, and we would like you to make sure that you abide by the copyright. And if you do use any of the slides, attribute them appropriately. Thank you very much indeed. Enough of the legal notice. A little bit SNIA. SNIA is 185 industry-leading organizations in the storage arena. It's the Storage Networking Industry Association, so our focus is primarily on storage. We've got 2,000 active contributing members, people who they help us design standards, develop standards, and do materials like this to educate and promote storage. And we also have 50,000, I beg your pardon, that's more than 50,000 IT end users and storage pros worldwide that follow us on a variety of platforms, including this one, where we make presentations on a very regular basis. So what is it that we do, the Cloud Storage Technologies Initiative? Well, it's to do with cloud storage and all the associated technologies that go with it. So we have a fairly expansive portfolio, but primarily our goal is to educate, to actually give you information that serves your needs and that you can use in your daily jobs and as you're working, and educate yourself on what storage is all about, particularly cloud storage, to support and promote certain technologies like OpenStack or software-defined storage or Kubernetes. So there's a whole environment out there that we support and promote, to attempt to understand hyperscaler requirements and that we incorporate them into our educational materials and into the standards and programs. And we also collaborate with other industry associations where appropriate to help try and broaden the scope of what it is that we do as an industry association. So today's agenda, we've got two main speakers today. That's Mounir and Eric. And first I'm going to hand over to Mounir, who's going to talk about the changing threat landscape and the responses to COVID-19 in particular. And then later on, we'll hand over to Eric, who will talk about some data protection strategies. So Mounir's going to lay out the threats, and Eric will provide us with some of the protection strategies we might use to mitigate those threats. So, without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Oh, it says Eric here. Is that correct, Eric? Was it you
Yeah,
or is
that's
it
correct.
Mounir?
I figured that was a test to see if Mounir and I were paying attention.
So who is it? Do I move forward?
It is. I'll
It's,
take it.
it's Eric, yes.
All right, I do beg your pardon. Okay, Mounir, over to you. The changing
Okay.
threat landscape.
It's another test. It's Eric
Yeah.
is going to take over.
All right, I'll take it.
Oh, I beg your pardon. I beg your pardon.
All right. So, yeah, some of what we're definitely going to address here is as this slide says. So it's a little more than washing your hands and wearing a mask in this era of COVID. There's an awful lot that's going on in the cyberspace that warrants paying attention to, and so we're gonna cover some of the what I would call sort of generic issues, but really going to try and emphasize what we're seeing from a COVID perspective. And I mean, what's different? So bear with me as I talk about some of the the threat landscape. It is what it is, but then I'm going to emphasize certain aspects of that are particularly important where we're at today. I've found that when talking about the cyber arena, that there's often a lot of confusion as to what do we mean by things like information security and cybersecurity and privacy and data protection and ethics, and so I've made an attempt to sort of loosely show some of the interdependencies, interactions that typically exist, and I won't necessarily belabor the point, but that said, a lot of what we're going to talk about today is going to deal with cybersecurity, whereas information security is a much broader topic and can involve paper. Imagine that still exists. And in the case of privacy, which has a lot of regulations and regulatory legal aspects of it, as well as technology, there's a data protection element. And you see that there's definitely an intersection between information security and privacy, or you might say a collision, you might say collaboration, sort of depends on how that works out. So when you hear some of these terms in this session, hopefully this kind of helps you understand that there are definite differences, and they those differences can be subtle but very important. And with that, I will move to, let's get right into the heart of where the bad guys and ladies operate. So this is a list of things that have been identified as the threat landscape in cyberspace. And in general, they're listed, order of prevalence. So how frequently, how often are you likely to encounter these? And the significance of the red is that these have been enhanced, if you will, as part of the COVID situation. So, and I'm going to talk to those in particular, but mention a few other ones. So, social engineering is a ongoing plague for those of us that operate in the security community. We often say that the human is the weak link, and social engineering absolutely exploits that situation. So this is people calling up and trying to get you to give your banking information, or you get an email message with a special link that lets you go enter all of your account information so that they can later on slurp up whatever it is they're trying to get access to. It's often used as if you've got a multi-stage attack. Social engineering is often a technique that's used to sort of start that chain of the attack. The second one, advanced persistent threat. This is the one that's scary from a security community perspective. If you've been tracking the you've been tracking any of the news in the last month or so, you've probably heard the term solar winds, and this plays into that space. It's a combination of a few supply chain security kinds of issues, but it's definitely an advanced persistent threat issue. Ransomware and malware, again, another one of those threats that we try to guard against. Ransomware is actually a subset of malware. We'll talk more about that in a little bit. But this is a scourge that some of us have been trying to address for years, and it just doesn't seem to go away, and it's not likely to, because it's a very effective tool, especially when married with social engineering. It's often the way the payload for the bad guys arrives on your systems. So that's one of the mechanisms. One of the other ones is the fourth bullet here, which is unpatched, unupdated systems. As time goes on, vulnerabilities are discovered and ultimately exploited. So we're seeing that there are forms of malware that can, in fact, find these vulnerabilities on systems that haven't really been updated and exploit those, and do it in a way that it's almost automated. So it's the seek and destroy sort of mentality. Similar to this is security misconfigurations. So this is if you're running a firewall on your laptop, for example. Well, if it's it's installed but it's not enabled, it's not giving you much protection, and that's the kind of thing that can also result in your system being exploited. You might actually have vulnerabilities, but if you get certain security software, it might actually protect you. However, if the security software is not functional, it clearly isn't doing that protection. The denial of service and distributed denial of service. This is a situation where some of the emerging technologies are playing into this. We've had multiple instances where camera systems and other forms of IoT, Internet of Things, light bulbs, that are connected, that can actually be used. They do a small contribution to distract maybe a website or something, but when you have millions of these operating, they can actually bog down the most powerful of servers just because of the sheer volume of an attack, and that's essentially the distributed denial of service. But we're definitely seeing that this IoT, and when IoT is combined with things like 5G networks, where you've got higher bandwidth to these remote devices, they become even more effective in sort of participating in those kinds of problems. The next one is sensitive data exposures, and this is really one of the concerns I think most of us have. This is where your financial information, your healthcare, depending on what jurisdiction you're in. If you're in Europe, for example, there's lots of forms of personal data that fall into this, and essentially this is something happens and results in exposure which then could be exploited with some of the earlier techniques, which might be more directed to your organization or to you, and that's one of the scary things, is we're seeing it's becoming increasingly easy for the bad guys to essentially directly attack you, where a lot of people still think that that's just done for big companies. That's not necessarily the case. They're harvesting information. They're using, in some cases, they're actually using AI to look at the data that they've harvested or purchased, if you will, sort of in the black market, and then they turn around and leverage that. I guess the next one I'd like to talk about is cryptojacking. This has for a long time been a motivation for the bad guys to essentially get access to a lot of home systems as well as work systems. And they're essentially doing mining of cryptocurrencies. And as the value of cryptocurrency explodes, this becomes even more profitable. And basically, there's a need to do massive amounts of calculations, and they're essentially borrowing some of your processing capabilities, but it means they've taken over some aspect of your system. So if you're sitting there and you see your laptop is, the fan is continuously running and you're not doing anything, it might be a hint that, well, you're either getting an update or maybe somebody is actually doing a little digital currency mining on your behalf, but you're not getting the benefit of it. I'll move on to, I mentioned the malware. It's important to note that we're seeing a definite shift where lots of smart devices, your iPhones and Android phones, we're beginning to see more and more malware that's actually targeting those platforms. And that's a development that's not surprising. And the reason for that is more and more of us are using these devices to access our email, our banks. So it's something that you definitely need to be aware of. And many folks have not even bothered considering the use of software that might help sort of guard against this. But this is something that you should at least be aware of. Okay, so I could go on for a couple hours just talking about the threats, but I'll stop there.
There's a couple of questions actually that have just come in that are relevant to that particular slide. Just let me ask them of you. So the first one is the current threat landscape larger or smaller with all the distributed workplace efforts going on, i.e. working from home? I suspect the answer is larger.
Yes,
what's your take
it's definitely larger. And I'll talk to a little bit of that in the coming slides. And that's part of the problem, is it's definitely larger.
Okay. And the second question is, someone often hears IT pros say something like, "It's secure enough, let's deploy it." Once deployed, how often should security be reassessed, and are there any methodologies for that? I must admit, this thing about secure enough, let's deploy it is not normally what I hear. What I normally hear is, "Ooh, security. We really didn't think about that."
Yeah, the answer has actually shifted over the last few years. We've gone from a model of maybe you should be doing, for example, security scans of your systems on a weekly, monthly basis, to the mantra now is what we call continuous monitoring. So there's some level in many enterprises. There's some level of they're looking across their infrastructure, across their desktops and laptops on a regular basis. They may actually be running agents that are continuously monitoring what's going on, and if any anomalous behavior sort of shows up, it reports back to some central service that will allow the security pros to go, "Oh, that's odd. They normally work 9 to 5, Monday through Friday. I wonder why that system's knocking at the door on Saturday."
Yeah, so it's a continuous process rather than a periodic one. Yeah,
that's really where we've, in the security world, where we basically shifted.
Okay, thank you.
All right, so you talked a little bit about some of this already, but just to sort of recap, so what are the additional things that are happening? Well, we're seeing lots of phishing emails. I mentioned before that's part of the problem. It's definitely up. We're seeing lots of malicious apps. In the case of SolarWinds, it was actually a good app that had a bad piece embedded in it. Bad domains. So these are domains that were set up by the bad guys to do things. And I did a check a while back, and there were over 65,000 domains established with something to do with COVID, to give you an idea of what is happening. That's all new in the past year. We've got the ongoing problem of the insecure endpoints and users. Some of this is because people have moved into home environments and they may be using bring your own device, or they've moved into the home environments, and they've got, you know, certain IoT, you know, a lot of sort of modernization of homes, and that, and the combination of bringing things into their home environment adds to complexities, because you may actually have one of these devices be the entry point for the bad guys to essentially get into your network or monitor what's happening inside your network. If you were sitting in your office, that would not be, you know, a point of concern, if you will. The vulnerabilities at vendors and third parties. SolarWinds is a perfect example of that. Is that even if you're doing everything you can, you may still get a surprise. I mentioned the next one, dealing with sort of the communications. Healthcare is a huge target right now. You know, that entire industry is under duress because of COVID, and so they aren't necessarily keeping up with what they should be keeping up with from a cyber perspective, because they're just trying to stay alive. In many cases, literally alive, and so they're definitely a target. Plus, they have lots of very valuable data, and there's a lot of money that's involved with the healthcare. So it's like almost the perfect target. And so that's something we've seen a lot of ramping up. And of course, there's as the COVID era continues to morph in terms of what we're focusing on, and ultimately the recovery, the bad guys are shifting with that at sort of every turn, and that's going to be part of the ongoing problem. The FBI actually has a COVID response page that I try to keep an eye on. One of the things that I find particularly disturbing is that there are lots of concerns about crimes against children. If you imagine, at least in the United States, we've got massive number of kids who are online continuously. And that puts them at greater risk from a security perspective, especially if you know their connection points, you know, the homes that they're connecting to and whatnot don't have a lot of security controls in place. So this is something that I have to be very, very careful about. It's normally a problem we worry about, but in the COVID area, this is definitely something that the FBI has identified that you really, as parents and professionals and teachers, you need to keep an eye on. There's the other area is fraud, and the latest twist is fraudulent cures. So we've seen it going from, you know, fake cures to now that there's actually vaccines. Now they're actually, you know, trying to sell you the vaccine itself, and of course it's not available for purchase. So, you know, feel free to throw your money away, but you may actually get more than you bargained for in that. So there's lots of, you know, work from home fraud kind of things. You know, start your own business, all these kinds of things. Lots of hits against unemployment insurance and paycheck protection program that was underway. The government has got its hands full trying to deal with this, so the bad guys are running rapid there. And watch out for charity scams. This is a huge area that with COVID, just because of, you know, the pain and anguish, you know, people want to help, and the bad guys are definitely exploiting that situation. The CISOs, in terms of responding, again, they're really trying to keep their head above water. In many cases, they were their security infrastructure may have been designed to accommodate maybe 10% of the workforce working outside of, you know, the enterprise. Now we're in a situation where 90% of the people may be outside and 10% working inside. You know, they're scrambling to basically deal with, what does that mean? How do you improve the throughput with your VPNs, for example? That, you know, we're not designed to deal with this. In many cases, you see the last bullet here is, you know, robbing Peter to pay Paul. Most of the big projects have effectively been suspended Just due to workforce problems, we're seeing even the security professionals are losing their positions in enterprises as they downsize. So it's really a matter of a bit of what we call whack-a-mole. A problem pops up, and the CISOs are trying to basically deal with it, and that's going to continue, I think, until we go back into the enterprises, if you will, the way we were. But I think you're going to find that the way we were is changed in many situations. Lots of concerns on endpoint security. So this is your laptops, and that gets even more complex when you're using your own devices as opposed to the company or organizations. A lot more dependencies on mobile security. And there are attempts to introduce things like multi-factor authentication, where you enter a password, but then maybe you've got to do something with your phone, to get in. These are all attempts to try and put in some sort of controls, to protect the enterprises. Lots of monitoring of end users, but in many cases, because this is outside, it's all new behavior, so it's hard to determine what's good behavior versus what's bad behavior. So this is driving the CISOs crazy at the moment. Malware, I mentioned earlier, is a big problem. A lot of this comes down to basically patching the operating systems and browsers and the operating systems. This needs to be done at sort of all of these layers, if you will, on a regular basis. It's absolutely critical that you're running antivirus software, to guard against this, and keeping it up to date. So maybe picking up signature files on a fairly frequent basis, at least daily, and if an update gets pushed out, for the software itself, making sure you're taking that as soon as you can. You absolutely want to avoid clicking on attachments. Even if you know the name, you want to be careful about just blindly chasing things, and it sort of plays into the social engineering. If one of your colleagues has their system is compromised, often what will happen is the bad guys will leverage their email to spray out lots of bad messages. Safe browsing is important. Strong passwords, strong as in I like to use about 12 characters or more, as opposed to 6 or 7 is definitely not want to be in that space. You want to be careful about not using sort of public internet connections and not using some sort of encryption on the communications. That's absolutely critical. Otherwise, everything you're doing is basically easy to monitor. And really, really basic things like firewalls and antivirus on your laptops and all the systems is critical to combating malware. I mentioned earlier, ransomware is a subset of this, and it's a pretty frightening beast at the moment. And we're talking billions of dollars are being lost. And this is one of those where you personally could be attacked. The bill that you might be confronted with might be small but annoying. It might be $500, $600 to sort of get your files back, and you may or may not get your files back, even if you pay it. In the enterprise space, and we're seeing some of the hospitals that have been hit with this, are paying in the millions of dollars to get a recovery. And as you can see in the stats here, that there's a pretty good rate of recovering the files. That's the good news. The not so good news is it may not, because you've got the encryption key that allows you to basically get rid of the ransomware or get rid of the encryption, if you will. It may be because you had actually done backups and whatnot. And I think Mounir is going to talk a little bit about some of this in his section. But those data protection mechanisms are absolutely critical when you're thinking about the ransomware situation. So how do you deal with ransomware? Well, one of them is assume that you're a victim and that, you know, your system has been bricked or almost bricked from your perspective, unusable. So what would you do in terms of, you know, what data can I not lose? And is it someplace that the bad guys can't get at? Because in some cases in enterprises, they'll do reconnaissance for an extended period of time. Definitely we need to make sure that people understand that a lot of the phishing and social engineering is a route in for the ransomware. You want to minimize the attack surface. So this is where making it hard for them to get at you. So, you know, get rid of the viruses, if you will, the malware. And so any kind of software there helps. There's also some anti-ransomware technology that is available. Most of it's focused on sort of endpoint monitor and protection. So you may actually in an enterprise have one system that's under attack. You may be able to spot it, take it offline before it actually infects all of its neighbors, so to speak. What that means in your house is it might be you and all your kids' PCs and whatnot. Wherever the data is, especially if you're using things like cloud and other mechanisms, you want to make sure that you've got backups. And some of those backups are not necessarily online because the bad guys are often monitoring backup systems and they'll take them out before they actually run a full-blown attack. We've seen that in numerous cases. Incident response is a big deal, again, for some of the larger organizations, knowing what to do, when to do it, and who to contact. And you don't want to be figuring this out in the middle of an attack. You want to have some of this laid out in advance. Cyber insurance, more organizations are using this. You know, what role does ransomware play in that? And again, we call it the defense in depth or layered defense. You want to try and nip, so to speak, in the bud different forms of attacks or attack vectors. And so if you've got different kinds of security mechanisms in place that may help you sort of guard against this. So it's a bit of a whirlwind tour of sort of the threat landscape and what's going on with COVID. I'm going to turn it over to Mounir to talk a little more about the data protection strategies and how some of that has been affected and related to some of the COVID activities. Mounir?
Thank you, Eric. Thank you, Eric. Yes, I'll take it over from here. So I'll start by trying to agree on some standards in the market from data protection perspective and what is data actually. So starting from what is data protection to start with? What is data? We need to understand what is data. And I see in the industry, the term data and information are used interchangeably, but actually they don't mean the same thing. We need to clarify that to every user. And then what's the need for data protection? And then how do we do data protection? And then there is a misconception across almost all IT users that data protection or backup is the archive of the organization. So I want to try to demystify the relationship and see if this makes sense, or for archiving, we need to consider a different technology or a platform. And then eventually, we will be discussing the how we can protect the data and what forms of protection are available today. So what is data actually? And how different it is from information? So the industry definition of data is a representation of any information or anything that is not processed. So for example, a social security number by itself has no significance or meaning. A driver's license number, a passport number, all these numbers in itself do not represent a piece of information unless it's combined with something else. Now, data also can be either a hard copy or a soft copy. So a hard copy could be papers, photos, videos, etc. And data can be digital in binary format or an analog format when we talk about analog videos recording, for example. And where can we store the data in the binary format? Typically, it's on disk, tape, or the cloud. And how do you define data? There are two major streams for data in the market today. The first one is structured data, which is practically tables and columns and rows, which is databases in general. And unstructured data, which is typically like pictures, like photos, like emails. All of this are unstructured data, and there is a significant different ways to deal with each one of these from data protection perspective. So what's the definition of information? Information is a data that is processed. So a table of social security numbers with names and addresses, for example, is a type of information that can be consumed and used by another application. It has, in general, information has some meaning or context that people can extract value out of it. And it's not only a single data point, typically it's multiple dimensions of rows and columns to represent information that has a value. And also it could be a series of data points that can be interpreted with a context such as application process data in a way that meaningful to the person who's receiving it. So basically, information is data that is consumable by humans or by another application, versus data is only consumable by an application, but has no meaning by itself. So let's ask the question, why do you need to protect the data? So since the humanity learned about the way to store information, they realized that information is subject to data loss, partially or totally. There could be a media failure, and this is across the board. All of us have experienced a disk failure or a tape failure, and data is beyond recovery. Corruption, which is very common in the industry today, especially with databases and structured data. And error, mistake, or inadvertently or intentionally changed. So as Eric mentioned earlier, there might be a bad actor who's trying to delete your data or encrypt it, or somebody who deleted a file by mistake, and he has no way to recover back that file. So a data protection will help him recover that. And then eventually, as Eric had addressed before, due to the fact of the COVID invasion to our life, we realized that we need to expand beyond regional office to work from home to all the users almost. And with that, we have the security people, in order to maintain performance, or at least satisfactory performance, they ended up having to compromise some of the security concerns. And that becomes a serious threat to the organization with any open backdoor to security of the data. And another example is, even when Egyptians learned to store information in stones, they soon realized that stones are subject to corrosion, and eventually the data might be lost. So they realized that even engraving in stone or inscription is not good enough unless you have multiple copies of the data. So the bottom line is, there is a serious need to protect information, and it has always been there, and it will be an integral component of information preservation. So what is data protection? Data protection is the process of creating copies of digital data, and ideally it should be stored on an independent media to ensure a level of separation. So even if the original media is impacted, you don't want to have all your eggs in one basket. So separate media for the backup provides you a better way of restoring the data if your original media is no longer available. So for example, if I have a disk that I keep a copy of the data on the same disk, if the disk is gone, both copies are gone. Or accidental deletion, if there's a link between the two copies and the user makes a mistake and delete one, you might end up deleting both. So keeping another copy on a different media provides a safe way to recover the data back if everything falls apart. Now, on the other hand, there are some data protection methods are subject to the same risks as we just said now, like disk copies on the same disk is a risky proposition. Having the data and its backup on the same server or the same hardware can put you at jeopardy if you lose that hardware. And historically, at the age of the disks itself, the removable disks used to be an attractive media to copy or back up the data and take it offline. But over time, the industry has realized that removable disk media is subject to extreme vulnerability, and the whole industry went away from removable disk backups. So what is what data protection is not? Now, historically, 20, 30, 40 years ago, there were only two flavors of data storage available. There were only disks and tapes. And disks typically were very high cost, very fast, and very high performance, and very vulnerable. And eventually they realized it is not movable enough and you cannot create a logical separation. On the other hand, tape was always portable, was always low cost, and provides very good isolation simply by writing to the tape my backup and moving it offline gives me enough separation for the data that even if my source data is no longer available, I have a good copy that I can transport to somewhere else and restore and continue working. So at that time, organizations said, okay, because of the actual need for archiving, tape will suffice to support this requirement. That used to be the industry norm. Like if you go 20, 30 years back, when you speak with an IT manager or a data center manager and ask him, what is your archive? He says, okay, these are my tapes, these are my archives. Now, this has changed dramatically. The reason is, over time, there is a multiple storage technology that offers different levels of performance and availability that customers or end users may select another disk platform to host their archive. That's one thing. And then they can still meet their archiving requirements with a disk. There is it's very well known in the industry that tapes come always with its own problems of managing tapes and data and tape loss in transits. And then finally, even the legislative parties who enforce regulations and actually put the rules for compliance, when they come for an inquiry or search for some event in your data, they want a fast request. So typically, if you get an inquiry from an FBI or a legislative authority for some of your data, you are required to respond within a certain time frame, which typically the tape is not good enough to meet that time frame. So at the end of the day, organizations now clearly see that yes, tapes have their own merits, but they don't fit in the profile of data archiving. And a better way to provide data archiving, supporting search and quick response to requirements is a must for organizations subject to compliance requirements and archive retention requirements. So how do we protect data? The starting point is we need to create multiple copies of the data. It could be in any form or all of these forms. There could be data cloning, snapshots, backup to disk, tape, or the cloud, data replication, and finally, what has been developing over the past few years is, in response to ransomware, creating a backup copy that is air-gapped and there is no access to it to prevent from the malware actors trying to access your backup. And what we need to agree on here today is, yes, backup itself has its own merits, but it also has lots of challenges from performance perspective and from meeting recovery time and recovery point objectives for customers. So yes, we encourage customers or end users to continue using backups, traditional backups, but also they should consider employing additional utilities or tools to give you a faster response to recovering data. For example, almost all virtual environments now and almost all database users create snapshots of the data, because if the database is down, there is almost always the situation where I don't have the luxury to wait to restore from the backup. I need a faster response. So they use data cloning or snapshots to provide a faster way to recover the data, even in case of a data corruption. But that does not eliminate the need for backups. So an organization should consider hiring or employing multiple tools to meet their disaster, their backup and data recovery requirements based on the situations. So let's address air gap solution for a moment. So what happens typically when you are a subject to a malware is that if there is a bad actor penetrating into your environments, the first thing he will do is look for your safety net. And your safety net is always the backup. So the first point of attack to an end user is the backup. So what you need to do is when you create a backup, you would try to make sure that this backup is somehow isolated in a way that it's not accessible by bad actors or even to your normally day-to-day users. Actually, in a matter of fact, there are some vendors now who are coming with a second group of backup capabilities that's being hidden from the end users, and this is being used to recover from ransomware in addition to traditional backup. That's one way of doing things. The other way is create a backup copy that's being isolated, and tape can serve this in a very good way, but there are much better ways to do that now. So organizations who are really worried about ransomware and protecting from ransomware, they may need to look for an isolated data protection solution or an air gap solution. So what's happening during the pandemic? Pandemic has created an unprecedented remote work from almost 10% remote users to almost 90 or 100% remote users. At the end of the day, this created a very high workload on your WAN connectivity and your security measures, and that in most cases, to get away with providing access to users, security organization may overlook some of the security gaps and provide an easy backdoor to the malware actors to penetrate into your account and start dealing and penetrating with your data and stealing it or even encrypting it. And there is also a case law that it's much safer to not have retention policy than failing your retention policy itself. And eventually, under the many privacy compliance obligations is requesting now immutable storage so that even malware actors cannot go and tamper with the contents. So under the law, there is a kind of self-own, can be kept confidential if the organization has a foresight to conduct such review under protection of attorney. So basically, whatever measures the organization considers for protecting themselves from the malware and ransomware attacks, they need to revise this capability with an attorney to make sure that this is something that is supporting them under the event of a malware attack. And it is ideally recommended to create a set of emergency guidelines for such situation that there is a backdoor for malware or bad actors penetrating in your account. And eventually, if you are hit by a ransomware, it's typically too late to deal with the situation. And in my experience, where I dealt with many accounts who have actually been subject to malware, they were so deeply impacted that all their backups were gone. And the only way for them out was to pay the ransom or get out of business. And the examples of organizations who went out of business due to ransomware are abundant. You can do a search for that and you will see a lot. Now, the final thought is, I am not promoting the fact that you should be paying the ransomware, but I'm promoting the fact that consider yourself today or tomorrow or sometime in your next future might become a victim of a ransomware. And you should have enough good measures to protect you in that situation. So the final thoughts are, adversaries are changing, the landscape of the threat is changing, and don't believe that your security tools will protect you. They might provide some level of protection, but I'll use the example is that with all the investment in the police in all the world, there is still crime. So there is always the criminal is going one step ahead of the police of coming with a new idea to steal your information. Make sure that data is your business and your money, so protecting it and having it close to your heart is a must to continue in business. Continue to educate your people to look for phishing and look for loopholes in security and protect themselves. I know that it's not possible across the board, but at least a regular training for your employees not to click on phishing emails or suspicious links, because that could open the whole door for everything. And then another threat that's happening, which is the 5G IoT, is actually broadening the landscape of threat dramatically. And then even we hear about telephones being hijacked, mobile devices being hijacked, and they are used to penetrate into your system. And at the end of the day, you have to employ good measures, good tools, and good technology. And also consider that you might at any point in time become a victim of a ransomware. I'll pass it to Andy to see if you would like to discuss any of the questions that came across.
Thank you, Mounir. That was good. I've got a couple of apologies to make. First of all, there's a little bit of background noise going on. I'm not quite sure where it's coming from. And secondly, my confusion at the beginning of the presentation as to who was doing what and what order. However, we do have a couple of questions we've got time to tackle. And I think that there were a couple that were asked about air gapping. That's fine. We dealt with air gapping. One that I think is really interesting is, do either of you, and I'll start with Mounir and we'll get on to Eric, do any of you have recommendations for rapid responses to an ongoing threat? I think that's one thing a lot of people worry about is we're in the middle of a threat. What should we do? It's not ended yet, but still, what are the strategies we should have to deal with this? Mounir, do you want to take the first cut at that?
Sure. Basically, the malware itself and the type of ransomware invading the market today has a very broad footprint. And the ideal situation is create multiple copies at different time intervals and keep them all offline. So what happens typically is if a bad actor manages to go through your security systems into your environment, chances are your backups are already infected. And if it was a Trojan attack, chances are this has been dormant in your system for quite some time. And if it was not discovered day one, chances are even your security tools will not be able to identify it. So having different backup copies that's being air-gapped at different time intervals can provide you a historical recovery point that is before the time you have been hit, and then you can restore this and avoid the whole cumbersome of dealing with a malware that you don't really understand or don't know how to deal with.
Okay, Eric?
Yeah, I'll come at it from a different angle. And so let's say that you are under attack at the moment. So you figured out that you've got a particular set of systems, or maybe a single system that's under attack. The natural inclination may be to actually just power off the system. That's not necessarily the best route. You clearly want to disconnect it from the network so that it doesn't necessarily infect its neighbors, so to speak, or give the adversary expanded access. But if you're at least in an enterprise setting, you want to disconnect it from the network, whether it's hardwired or Wi-Fi connection, and then get appropriate help to do diagnostics and whatnot. In some cases, if you're running ransomware, you may be confronted with a system that essentially might have a functional operating system, but basically no data, and might have a fun little message on the screen that basically says, pay X number of dollars within 24 hours. You're going to want to capture that kind of information so that you can actually make a decision as to whether you're going to pay the ransom or not, and then proceed. But that said, the type of incident that you're dealing with can vary significantly, and larger organizations tend to map out strategies for how they're going to deal with different effects. And I've worked for organizations that were multinational or diverse locations, and knowing, for example, that if you've got an incident in Singapore, how is that going to be dealt with? How and when do you engage the authorities and all those kinds of things? Communication and legal teams, knowing who to call, when to call, and having that up front, before you get into a mess is absolutely critical to surviving these kind of events. They're messy anyways, but if your starting point is, and there have been some organizations that essentially didn't even know who worked for them because they lost so much of their infrastructure. So those are the kind of scenarios where if you've done some pre-planning, you've probably printed the plan and the call down list. Whereas if you've not done anything, you may not know anything.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point, actually. The preparation in advance to be able to, there are certain times as well when you're legally obliged to tell people within a very short space of time. I think in Europe you get 24 hours for a major data breach, for example. So
right.
It's that kind of thing is incredibly important. Practicing the disaster. Thank you both. So what we're going to do now is I would like you to rate the webcast and provide us with some feedback as you leave the webcast today. That would be really good. The webcast and a copy of the slides are going to be available in the SNIA Educational Library. One of the things we will do is take all the questions we've had here, even though we've answered them during the presentation. We'll take the questions we've been asked and we'll actually answer them in some more detail. There were a couple of others that we could answer, but we've run out of time to do so. But we'll answer those on the cloud blog at sniacloud.com, and you can follow us on Twitter at sniacloud.
Hey, Alex.
Sure.
I have one thing that I've actually experienced across the market. I'd like to bring it to the audiences, which is there is a misconception that disaster recovery can be used in case of ransomware. And 9 out of 10 situations, your disaster recovery environment gets impacted immediately with your production. So don't assume that your disaster recovery will help you in a ransomware scenario.
Good point. Thank you. That's an excellent point. Some of the references we have for you, we've got a whole bunch of links here that you can follow to other presentations on other particular topics that we've been covering over the period. And I would recommend that you follow us on our blog. That's a good place to get information about what we will be talking about, what's up and coming, and the presentations we've already done. In the meanwhile, I'd like to thank everybody. Thank everybody for attending. Thank everyone for their patience. This is a new interface for us, so we've got a few hiccups today, but we'll get there. I'd also like to thank Eric Hibbard and Mounir for presenting us with a really good set of slides and information. And thank you very much indeed as an audience for participating and asking us questions. In the meanwhile, have a good day, whatever the rest of your day looks like, and keep safe. Thank you very much.
Thank you.